Good afternoon. I guess we should start. My name is Alden Habakon. I have the privilege of moderating what promises to be a very dynamic session on public media. We have three panelists and myself very passionate about this topic, and I'm sure everyone here has strong opinions about public media. For many Canadians, when you hear the words media democracy, you think of public media. This whole conference could be about public media, and it'd still be Media Democracy Day. But perhaps we don't take enough time to ask what makes media public. And the description of this panel refers to a connection between non-commercial media and democracy, and perhaps social sustainability. And the first thing that came to mind when I read that was, is non-commercial media sustainable? So to discuss this topic, we have three great speakers who will provide some deep perspective on this. To my left is Jean Broughton, staff representative for the Canadian Media Guild, the union which represents CBC employees, the TVO, TFO, APTN, and some private broadcasters. And to her left is Sylvia Richardson. Sylvia is the Vice President of the Association Mondiale des Radiodiffuseurs Communautaires. That's the AMARC North America, which is the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters. She's also a PhD student at the Faculty of Education at SFU and the host and producer of Latin Waves. And on the far left is Tyler Morgenstern, who many of you know for his work with Media Democracy Days. He's also an arts, culture, and political writer with publication credits in SADMAG, Artthreat, rabble.ca, Huffington Post, and Toronto Star. And he's also part of OpenMedia's Reimagine CBC, an initiative that currently serves as program director at the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I just want to congratulate the organizers for getting such a great group together. Oh, I forgot one point. By the way, Latin Waves airs on CJSF 90.1 on Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 12 a.m. So we just missed today's broadcast, right? Please join me in welcoming this great panels. So I'm gonna try to format the panel as conversational as possible, and we're hoping that to get some really great questions. I hope you have hard questions from the audience, like I said, in the latter half. But just to get us started, I'd like to ask our panelists some key questions, and that should take us about 30 minutes. We'll give them about 30 minutes to respond, and then I've asked each of them to prepare a question or to come up with a question for each other. I really enjoy hearing experts in this area challenge each other and ask questions of each other to do with public media, and then we'll open it up to you, and by then I should have given you plenty of time to jot down a question or come up with a tough question. And like I said, if for some reason you don't feel comfortable standing up and sharing your question, please just pass it up to the front. So I'd like to begin with Tyler, if that's okay. I know you've been speaking on the Reimagine CBC project and talking about this concept of publicness in media, and perhaps you can begin with giving us a framework for what makes media public versus what isn't public media, and how this contributes to fostering democracy.
Thanks, Alden. That's forceful, hey? Well, thank you, Alden, for that introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. Just gonna get my time going. So, as Alden mentioned, I come to this particular conversation from a project called Reimagine CBC, which actually just ended its 9-month run with a wrap party and a report launch in Toronto. And for those who aren't familiar, Reimagine was this massive online brainstorming project that asked Canadians from all across the country one question, which was, in your view, what does the future of the CBC and public media in general in Canada look like? In the midst of crisis and budget cuts and these kind of cynical calls, what I think are cynical calls for privatization, we wanted to reclaim and shift the conversation and find out what Canadians actually value in their CBC and how those values could be translated into a really exciting and innovative and resilient future for public media. And if you want to know more about that project, nuts and bolts wise, I'm happy to answer questions. But like I said, I'm gonna be addressing more a general question of what is public media. And I think the most effective way to answer that is not by trying to define it as an object, but by trying to lay out what it does. What is public media as a set of practices and a set of commitments? And how do those commitments sort of deepen democratic commitments and in the way that we interact with one another politically and culturally? So, big question, what does public media do? So to answer that, I want to return to Reimagine CBC for just a second. And from the beginning, what really drew me to that project was that it was something that tried to create a space where people could really truly engage with an interested or with an engaged interest community with their kind of hopes and visions for what the CBC could be. And that one environment which we as Canadians all share, like it or lump it, you know, whether or not you hate the CBC or you love the CBC or somewhere in between, we do all share it in it being a public broadcaster. And so it was designed to give an opportunity for people to feel as they should, like they have a real role to play in shaping the future of the media that we all pay for, and that are, unlike any other media entity, mandated, legislatively mandated to serve the public interest before profit. So in other words, even though it kind of collected practical ideas about techniques and programming and tools that it could use to be really innovative in the future, for me it really did put the public before media. It was as much about the process of working through ideas as it was about implementing them and operationalizing them. So it was a space that, for me, at its best, approximated what public media institutions like the CBC, at their best, can be, which are environments where alternative and conflicting voices, narratives, and priorities can come together, even if in antagonistic ways, to work through what it means to be a part of the public, what it means to tell our stories, what it means to make decisions about how we're seen and how we see each other. And I think that creating that kind of environment is precisely what a robust, well-funded public media alternative does. It puts the public before the media, and it puts process before product, but without neglecting it, obviously. It asks how images and stories and songs can grow out of communities, and then uses our media infrastructure to connect those voices together into really rich networks of meaning that we can all share in and identify with. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what commercial media does, which is use images and stories and songs and other cultural products to, in fact, segment and marketize audiences, to corral people into arenas that can then have their attention sold off to advertisers. And so for all of its problems, which of course we do need to take seriously, and I think Gia is going to speak to later, in the CBC, we do really have something pretty remarkable. We have an organization that takes stories from small communities and broadcasts them at a national level. We have national stories that get carried to small or marginal communities. We have a broadcaster that works in 2 official languages, 9 First Nations languages, and shares with us stories that we would otherwise never hear. And it's a place that's concretely mandated to be a platform where we can work through the tensions that make up our country. And so it's a place where we can come to see ourselves and think about ourselves as public subjects, as people who are engaged in processes of citizenship and democracy, as in processes of storytelling and media making that connect us to something larger than ourselves. Now, corporate media, by contrast, for corporate media, there is nothing larger than making money, plain and simple. They're accountable to advertisers and they're accountable to shareholders, but nowhere in their mandates or operating procedures is there an above all else commitment to the public good such as that set out in the Broadcast Act for the CBC. Quite the opposite. To make media profitable above all else, that which is not or less profitable, things like small communities, non-dominant language communities, communities with low purchasing power or high unemployment, they must not be optimally served. Because to optimally serve them would be to operate at a loss. And so to minimize those losses, corporate media organizations will always draw boundaries around who is and who is not worth admitting into the public. Now, it might be crazy, but that just doesn't sound like the basis of a democratic media system. Unless, of course, you want to take the market and the profit imperative as kind of the ultimate expression of our democratic ambitions. If you do, have fun. I no offense, but I don't want to be in your world for much longer. But I think that if the last year of protest and democratic experimentation all over the world has shown us anything, it's that we don't actually need to accept the idea that the best kind of subject and citizen we can be is a subject of the market. We and the democratic spaces that we create together, like public media environments, can and must be more than that if we're to adequately address the struggles that our communities face together. So, what is public media? Well, it's a kind of media that at the very least acknowledges that our democratic ambitions exceed the confines of blunt profitability. Now, our public media situation in Canada and in many places around the world, it's not perfect, and it probably never will be. But at its best, and with an engaged citizenry behind it, and with people advocating for its long-term sustainability, it points toward an exciting future of publicness and democratic practice to which we all contribute, and from which we can all benefit. Thanks.
Thanks, Tyler. Jean, along those same lines, I'm interested to know if you agree with Tyler's conceptualization of public media, and I'm especially interested to know what that definition or how that criteria are interpreted from the labor perspective. But more importantly, are there, can you provide maybe some tangible idea of the challenges faced by public media from the inside, and perhaps give us a perspective on the real impact of the recent cuts to CBC's appropriation and to the local programming improvement fund?
Yeah, so I wanted to start by just mentioning when we think about public media, I think we tend to think a lot about radio and television because those are the most obvious ways that it exists in our lives, but it also includes the internet, tweeting, blogs. The channels that kids watch at school are actually often public media in most provinces. And it's not just news, but also arts, documentaries, sports, Canadian drama, festivals, original Canadian series that employ more than just producers, but also actors, makeup artists, set designers. So really the public media sector is quite huge. As Tyler mentioned, the CBC is important because it tells stories that other broadcasters can't and won't. So if you live in a major center like Vancouver, which you probably all do, it's not as big of a deal, but if you're living in a remote or smaller community, or even a small community within a large city, the CBC can be a lifeblood. So if you think about francophone communities outside Quebec, the Radio-Canada provides a voice for that community, and for Indigenous communities in their languages, it serves a similar purpose. And you know, Goose Bay does not have CTV or Global. It's CBC and CBC alone. And because of that, the CBC is able to actually push the idea of what merits coverage in terms of, so the CBC will pick up a story and be followed by CTV, Global, and other broadcasters. And so it has this special emphasis that is simultaneously on the local and on the national, and is able to provide Canada with as much of an identity, as much of a kind of unified identity as possible, which is pretty interesting in a place that's so broad and so diverse. And so Alden mentioned the challenges that the CBC is facing, and the major challenge is, of course, the funding cuts that we've recently faced. We had a 10% cut of our appropriation in the spring, and that's over 3 years, but it is ultimately a 10% cut. The local programming improvement fund has also been cut, and that's a fairly recent one. And what that was, most people probably haven't heard of this before, it was essentially a fee that the major broadcasters paid that was then reassigned or redistributed to stations that did local programming. So not only local news, but also, for example, there was a local there still is a local children's show in Edmonton in French that was funded by that project. And even before these cuts that we're facing now, the appropriation hasn't kept pace with inflation. So really the CBC has been in shrink mode since the 90s. And all of this is going on in a context where what you need to do to be in the media is to grow and grow and grow. There was not really as much internet presence in the 90s as there is now.